A few hours ago, Iran announced that the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. That's 20% of the world's oil just stopped. And what they said next about why it's closed, that's the part that should terrify you. And look, stuff like this gets quiet real fast. So if you want to keep hearing the parts the big networks skip, go ahead and subscribe. That's the whole point of this channel. So there's a new announcement out of Tehran this morning, and I'm going to walk you through exactly what it says, because the words they chose, the specific phrasing, matters more than you think. The Iranian Gulf Navigation Management Authority put out a statement that on its face says navigation through the Strait of Hormuz has become impossible. That's the word they used. Impossible. Not dangerous, not restricted, not under threat. Impossible. Which is a hell of a word for a global shipping lane that carries about 17 million barrels of oil every single day. Now, when you hear news like this, your brain might go straight to gas prices, or maybe the stock market. And those are real concerns. But what I want you to understand is the actual mechanism here, the how and the why. Because this isn't just Iran saying, oh, things are tough out there. This is Iran making a calculated announcement that changes the rules of engagement for the entire region. The authority went on to say that resuming transit traffic will remain conditional on the stabilization of security conditions. Read that again. Conditional on the stabilization, which means they're putting the onus entirely on the United States. It's a direct line from Tehran to Washington, and they're daring someone to reply. So what prompted this? Well, it comes days after the Iranian Revolutionary Guard announced they'd targeted 2 naval tankers that attempted to cross the strait. And I need you to understand something about that phrase, targeted. In military language, that's not a warning shot. That's an action taken against a vessel. They're telling the world they are actively engaging ships in that waterway. And here's where it gets incredibly messy. The United States has been conducting what it describes as defensive military operations in the region. At least that's the official line. But if you've been paying attention to the last few months, if you've been tracking the buildup, you know that we're talking about something much bigger than a few patrols. Because Iran doesn't close the Strait of Hormuz for fun. They don't do it as a bluff. They do it when they perceive a genuine existential threat, or when they want to force a confrontation on their terms. And right now, they're telling the entire world that the United States has given them that reason. So let's step back for a second, because you and I both know this didn't start today. It didn't start last week. It didn't even start this year. This has been building quietly under the surface while the rest of the world was looking at other things. You remember the strikes last month? The ones that hit Iranian-linked targets in Syria and Iraq? The official explanation was retaliation for drone attacks on American bases. And that might be true as far as it goes. But the real reason, the deeper reason, was about sending a message about who controls the waterways. For months, the U.S. has been quietly increasing its naval presence in the Persian Gulf. Not just the aircraft carriers, but the smaller, faster vessels. The ones that can maneuver in tight spaces. The ones that can intercept small boats. And Iran sees that. They see every single movement. And here's the thing you have to understand about the Strait of Hormuz. It's narrow. Really narrow. At its most constricted point, it's about 21 miles wide. But the shipping lanes themselves are even tighter, only about 2 miles wide in each direction. So you've got enormous tankers moving through a virtual corridor, which means that a few small, fast boats, or a few well-placed mines, or a few shore-based missiles can shut the whole thing down. Iran knows this better than anyone. They've studied it, they've practiced it, they've run exercises simulating exactly this scenario. And for years, the conventional wisdom was that they wouldn't actually do it because the economic cost to themselves would be catastrophic. But what happens when the cost of not doing it becomes even higher? That's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. Because if you're the Iranian leadership and you're watching American forces move closer and closer to your borders, and you're watching sanctions tighten, and you're watching your economy crater, at some point, you decide that the cost of inaction outweighs the cost of action, and you do something that forces the other side to react on your terms. That's exactly what's happening right now. I spent the morning going through the official statements from both sides, and the language is fascinating. The Iranian statement uses the phrase American hostile military actions. That's the justification. They're saying that the closure isn't their decision, it's a response to American aggression, which, if you're on the U.S. side, sounds like pure provocation. But here's what's interesting. The U.S. hasn't officially responded yet. Not really. There have been some comments from State Department spokespeople, the usual stuff about freedom of navigation and the importance of the strait, but no forceful statement, no clear red line. And that silence, that's the part that makes me uneasy. Because if you're in the Pentagon and you hear Iran just effectively declared a blockade, you don't wait. You issue a warning. You make it clear that this won't stand. You move assets into position. So the fact that we're hearing this measured, almost careful language from Washington, it suggests they're not sure how to handle this one. Now let me tell you about the tankers that were targeted, because that detail is being glossed over by a lot of outlets. The Revolutionary Guard said they engaged 2 vessels, and I've been trying to confirm the specifics. One of them, from what I can piece together, was carrying crude oil. The other, something else, maybe chemicals, maybe refined products. But what matters isn't what they were carrying. What matters is that the Revolutionary Guard is admitting to it publicly. They're saying, we did this and we'll do it again. Think about that. A state military force with naval capabilities openly saying they attacked commercial shipping in international waters. And they're framing it as a legitimate response to American operations. That's not a small thing. That's a line being crossed. And if you go back and look at the history of this region, the history of these waterways, you'll see patterns. There was the tanker war in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq conflict. Hundreds of ships were attacked. There was the mining of the Strait in 2019. There have been dozens of incidents over the years, but always there was a sense of restraint, a sense that both sides were playing a game with rules. This feels different. Maybe it's the rhetoric. The Iranian announcement doesn't sound like a negotiating tactic. It sounds like a declaration. It sounds like a fait accompli. And the American response, or lack thereof, it feels like they're trying to figure out what to do next, because there are no good options. If you send more ships in, you risk a direct confrontation. If you don't, you're admitting that Iran has successfully closed a major global waterway. And the economic impact, look, I don't need to tell you how oil markets work. But this isn't just about prices at the pump. This is about supply chains. This is about insurance rates. This is about every single thing that moves through that waterway, which includes not just oil, but also liquefied natural gas, industrial chemicals, goods from Asia to Europe. Every single day, ships pass through the Strait of Hormuz, carrying about a third of the world's seaborne oil. That's not a small percentage. That's a dominant percentage. So when Iran says impossible, they're not just threatening the US, they're threatening the global economy. And here's where the political angle comes in. Because this is happening in an election year, and you've got a White House that's already facing criticism over its foreign policy, you've got a Republican-led Congress that's been pushing for a tougher stance on Iran. So what does the administration do? How do they respond without looking weak, but also without starting a war? This is the nightmare scenario for any foreign policy team, because every option is bad. Send in the Navy to escort ships through the strait? That sounds tough, but it also puts American sailors in harm's way, directly in the path of Iranian missiles. And if one of those ships gets hit, you're at war. Try to negotiate. That's the reasonable approach. But Iran is saying the only condition is the stabilization of security conditions, which means they want U.S. military operations to stop. So you'd be negotiating from a position of weakness, which just encourages more of this behavior. Do nothing. Let the market absorb the shock. But that sends a message to every other country, North Korea, China, Russia, that the U.S. is no longer willing or able to guarantee freedom of navigation. That's a seismic shift. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous, because all of those options are on the table, and nobody knows which one the U.S. will pick. Now I want to talk about what this means for the region, because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just important to the U.S. and Iran. It's important to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to Oman, to all of the Gulf states. These countries have their own ships, their own economies, and they're watching this unfold with a mixture of fear and anger. The Saudis have been in a proxy war with Iran for years. They've been bombed by Iranian-backed forces. They've had their oil facilities attacked. So when Iran closes the strait, the Saudi reaction is going to be loud. They're going to be pushing the U.S. to do something. And that pressure adds another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. And then there's China. China imports a massive amount of oil from the Middle East. All of it goes through the Strait of Hormuz. They're the largest customer for Saudi and Emirati oil. So this is a direct threat to their energy security. And China has a navy too, a growing one. So here's the thing to watch. Will the Chinese send their own ships to the region? Will they try to escort their own vessels? That would be incredible, actually. That would be the first major test of Chinese naval power in a high-stakes situation. But maybe that's the point. Maybe Iran is thinking, if we do this, the Americans might back off, but the Chinese will get involved. And that changes the whole equation. Because this isn't just a U.S.-Iran thing anymore. It never really was. It's about the global order. It's about who controls the seas. And the seas have been controlled by the U.S. Navy for decades. But if the U.S. backs down here, if they fail to guarantee access to a crucial waterway, what happens to the rest of them? The Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea. That's the longer game Iran is playing. They're testing the limits of American power. They're seeing how far they can push before someone pushes back. And look, I'm not an apologist for Iran. Their regime is brutal. They suppress their own people. They export terror. But that doesn't mean they're dumb. They're calculated. They're strategic. And this move fits a pattern. Remember when Trump was in office? Remember the maximum pressure campaign, the sanctions, the assassination of Soleimani? That was a different approach, more aggressive, more confrontational. And under that approach, Iran didn't close the strait. They attacked ships, yes, but they never made a formal declaration like this. They were afraid of what would happen if they pushed too hard. So why now? Why under a Biden administration that's been less overtly hostile? That's the paradox. Maybe it's because they see weakness. Maybe it's because the U.S. is distracted. Maybe it's because they've been emboldened by the lack of consequences for their previous actions. Or maybe it's because they've made a calculation that the American public doesn't have the stomach for another Middle East war. And if that's true, if they're right, then they can do whatever they want. So let me ask you a question directly. Do you think the United States would actually go to war over the Strait of Hormuz? Think about that for a second. I'm not asking what you want. I'm asking what you believe is likely. Because that's the question that's currently being debated in every security meeting in Washington. And the answer depends entirely on how you define the stakes. If it's just about oil, probably not. Oil prices can spike and then settle. The global economy can absorb a shock. There are other sources, other routes. But if it's about credibility, if it's about the message that's sent to every other country in the world about American power, then yes, then it's worth it. Then you have to respond. Because if you don't, you're admitting that the era of American naval dominance is over. And once that perception takes hold, you can't get it back. You can't just say, we're still the leader, and expect people to believe you. They've seen you back down. They've watched you fail to enforce the rules, and they'll act accordingly. That's the point Iran is making, whether they realize it or not. They're not just shutting down a waterway. They're asking a question. And the answer will define the next decade of global politics. I want to shift gears for a minute because this is going to get intense in the next few days. And I think it's important to understand the mechanics of how this actually works on the ground. The Strait of Hormuz is monitored closely. There are sensors, radars, all kinds of surveillance equipment. Both the US and Iran have a very clear picture of what's happening in that waterway at any given time. So when Iran says navigation is impossible, what they're really saying is that they're going to make it impossible. They're going to interdict ships. They're going to board them. They're going to inspect them. They're going to turn them back. And if any vessel tries to force the issue, the Revolutionary Guard has boats, missiles, and drones. And I gotta tell you, I've been reading about the drone capability. It's genuinely impressive. They have loitering munitions that can hit a moving target with incredible accuracy. They have swarms. They've demonstrated this in exercises. So the US Navy, for all its strength, it can't stop everything. It can't be everywhere at once. It can protect some ships, but not all of them. And that's the asymmetry that Iran is exploiting. They don't have to win a fight with the US. They just have to make it too costly for anyone to try and cross. Now I want to talk about the market reaction, because this is already happening. Oil futures are spiking as we speak. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I can tell you what the pattern looks like.
Sharp increase, volatility, a lot of nervous trading. And here's the thing about markets. They hate uncertainty. They hate not knowing what's going to happen next. And right now, nobody knows. If you're a shipping company, you're looking at your insurance rates and rethinking your routes. If you're an oil company, you're looking at your supply and your customers. If you're a consumer, you're going to see higher prices at the pump. That's just a fact. But it's bigger than that, because this could trigger a broader economic slowdown. And in an election year, An economic slowdown is a political crisis. So the pressure on the White House is going to be immense. And I gotta say, I don't envy the people making these decisions. They're in a bind. Every move they make is going to be criticized. Every move they don't make is going to be scrutinized. So let's talk about the Revolutionary Guard for a minute, because they're not just the military. They're an institution. They have their own interests, their own ideology, and they've been pushing for more aggressive action against the U.S. for years. This might be their moment. The moment where they prove that their strategy works, that they can challenge American power and get away with it. And if that happens, they're going to be even harder to contain going forward. Think about the internal politics in Iran. The civilian government, the religious leadership, the military. They're not always aligned. And right now, the Revolutionary Guard is ascendant. They've got the president's ear. They've got the supreme leader's approval. They're the ones calling the shots.
So this isn't just about oil and shipping. This is about who runs Iran. And the United States has to figure out how to respond to that too. If they retaliate, they play into the Guard's hands. If they don't, they look weak. It's a no-win. But let's be clear about something. The Guard doesn't want a full-scale war. They don't want to be bombed back to the Stone Age. They want to demonstrate that they can impose costs. They want to show their own people and the world that they're a force to be reckoned with. So they'll push, they'll test, they'll see how far they can go. And the U.S. has to draw a line somewhere. The question is where that line is. I want to go back to the statement from the Iranian Authority, because I think there's a detail in there that's easy to miss. They said resuming traffic is conditional on the stabilization of security conditions. That's a phrase that gives them a lot of wiggle room. Because what does stabilization mean? It's vague. It's undefined. It could mean the U.S. withdraws all forces. It could mean the U.S. stops all operations. It could mean something smaller, some token concession. The point is, they've set a condition that they can move the goalposts on. And that's a negotiation tactic. They want to create a situation where the U.S. has to ask them for permission to reopen the strait. Think about that. The United States of America, the world's sole superpower, asking Iran for permission to sail through international waters. That would be a humiliation of epic proportions. And the Iranians know it. That's the whole point. So what happens next? I think we see some escalation. The U.S. will probably respond with something, maybe more sanctions, maybe a show of force. But the question is whether it's enough. Because Iran has called the U.S. bluff. They've said we're closing the strait and there's nothing you can do about it. And if the U.S. responds with something weak, if they just issue a diplomatic protest, then Iran has won. And that cannot happen. Not if you want a stable world order. Not if you want the rules-based system to survive. But here's the thing. I'm not sure the American public cares enough to support a military response. I'm not sure the political will is there. And the Iranians are counting on that. They're gambling that the U.S. is tired of war. And they might be right. So we're at a moment of reckoning, a moment where the decisions made in the next few days will shape the world for a generation. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The people making those decisions, they don't have good options. They're choosing between bad and worse. And bad, in this case, means accepting a shift in the balance of power. Worse means war. So which one is it going to be? Now I want you to consider something. Imagine you're sitting in a briefing room in Tehran. You're the Revolutionary Guard commander. You just delivered the news that you've effectively shut down the strait. How do you feel? I think you feel confident. I think you feel like you finally forced the Americans to deal with you on your terms. Now imagine you're sitting in the White House. You're the president. You just got the briefing. You know what's at stake. How do you feel? I think you feel a lot of things. Anger, frustration, fear maybe, because you know that every option on your desk is a loser. That's the reality of this moment. There are no winners. There's only damage control. And that's the part that the headlines miss. The human element. The people in the rooms making the decisions. They're not robots. They're not caricatures. They're people with a lot of weight on their shoulders. So what can you do as someone watching all of this unfold from the outside? I think you can pay attention. I think you can understand that this isn't just another news cycle. This is a fundamental change in the way the world works. Because once the Strait of Hormuz is closed, once that precedent is set, it can always happen again. It can happen in other places. It becomes a tool that any country with a narrow waterway can use. And that's a world we haven't lived in. A world where the oceans aren't free. A world where the U.S. can't guarantee safe passage. That's a dangerous world. So I'm watching this closely, and I'm going to keep watching because the next few days are going to tell us a lot about where we're headed. And I don't think it's going to be pretty. One last thing, the Iranian statement. I keep coming back to it because it's written in that careful, formal language that governments use when they're about to do something really significant. It's not angry. It's not aggressive. It's clinical. And that's what worries me. Because when people are angry, you know what you're dealing with. When they're screaming and shouting, you know they're emotional. But when they're calm and clinical, when they're announcing something as huge as the closure of a major waterway with measured, precise language, that's when you know they've made a decision, a real decision, and they're not going back. This isn't a bluff. This is a move. And now the other side has to move. And that's the moment we're in. The moment after the move, before the response. The pause in the middle of the action. It's the most dangerous moment there is. I'll be here. I'll keep you updated. because this is the kind of thing that changes everything. And that's what I wanted to explain to you today. That's the part that doesn't make the headlines. The human calculation, the fear, the uncertainty. This isn't about oil. This is about power. And power is the only thing that matters in this world. I'll see you in the next one.